Good afternoon. I'm Michelle Williams, Dean of the Faculty here at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our When Public Health Means Business series. Today, we will focus on health, wealth, and the role of justice. Here we are, edging towards the close of 2020. And like many of you, I'm overwhelmed with what has been an enormously complicated and enormously taxing year. Just yesterday in the United States, we crossed a grim threshold. Over 200,000 Americans dead of COVID-19. Over 200,000 loved ones. To put this number into some context, that's more lives lost than in our country's last 5 wars combined. In addition to this, we are mired in one of the worst public health crises this country has ever seen. We are witnessing a long overdue racial reckoning that has resulted in large-scale protests across the country. After the tragic passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, we are now beholden to an all-out Supreme Court confirmation fight in the middle of an election. Both outcomes will have massive public health implications for decades to come. Climate protection, voting rights, healthcare access, women's reproductive health, all of it is on the line, and all of us will be impacted in some form. And on top of all of this, we are in the middle of a crushing economic collapse that has disproportionately affected Black, Brown, and low-income families across the country. These are heavy burdens for sure, but just as heavy is the starkly revealed truth that a person's experience in this country depends on the color of their skin. That truth is a reflection of the vast and entrenched disparities, not just in the everyday overt discrimination many of us face, but in the conditions in which we are born, grow up in, and live out our lives. COVID-19 or not, social determinants are the key drivers of health outcomes. When we are denied equal healthcare, equal education, equal access to healthy foods and healthy neighborhoods, you're denied equal opportunity, and that just cannot continue. You know, this past weekend, in an interview with the New York Times, comedian Chris Rock said something that was quite provocative. He said, Dr. King and those guys were amazing, but they knew nothing about money. They didn't ask for anything. At the end of the day, the things we got was just, hey, can you guys be humane? If they had to do it all over again, in hindsight, said Chris Rock, there would be some attention paid to the financial disparities of all of the years. Funny? Sure, Chris Rock is a comedian, but here's the thing. Chris Rock's point was that our current national conversation around racial inequalities must include a discussion of wealth disparities. And I'll take it one step further. We cannot talk about health and race without also talking about wealth and race. Health and wealth disparities are intertwined, and as such, they are public health crises. This is a complicated and sometimes very difficult conversation to have, but it starts by inviting people across sectors to have raw and honest conversations, such as the one we are hosting this afternoon. Many of you have heard me say public health is not a moment, it is an enduring movement. And this urgent movement must belong to all of us. Those of us in public health need to continue our fight. Those of us in business need to open our hearts and our doors to stay open to change. And those of us in government need to keep fighting for the people and the policies that will make this fight winnable. because now is the time to get this right. And so with that, please welcome Deirdre Bosa from CNBC. Deirdre, welcome and thank you so much for helping us continue this very important conversation. Thank you so much.
Dean Williams and everyone, thank you so much for having me here. I feel honored. And Dean Williams, I love how you shared some words from Chris Rock. And it is funny how in this crisis, comedians in a few cases have really been the ones able to find the right words. I'm reminded when you were talking about Chris Rock, about Dave Chappelle's Netflix special, 8 minutes, 46 seconds.
Yes.
That was so moving. We sat down and watched that together and don't necessarily know where it's going to go, but it leaves you almost quite speechless. So I love that example that you used. The second thing I wanted to say is just a little disclosure. I'm Canadian, like one of your previous moderators. So the idea of speaking about public health and discrimination, especially with this esteemed group, it quite frankly was a little intimidating for me at first. Growing up in Toronto, I took universal health care for granted. I'd been told that Toronto was the most diverse, multicultural city in the world. But of course, for many of us, this year has laid bare some really hard truths. I was looking up some statistics, and even in Canada, where I can't tell you how many people have told me over the last few months and few years, they'd like to just, run up north to the border. But the issues are very prevalent there as well. A majority, 60%, see racism as a serious problem. That's up 13 points from last year. And that's about the same level as a recent Ipsos NPR poll found in America. On CNBC, of course, we grapple with it day after day on a regular basis, but never so much as during this crisis. And it's difficult, I will say, to watch the markets go up and reach record highs, yet to see this massive divide continue to emerge between the markets and the economy, the haves and the have-nots. So I am really eager to have not a 10-minute, 8-minute, 10-minute interview to do this on TV, but have this incredible forum where you've had amazing speakers and discussions before this one. This is part 5, of course. And we have some really amazing people to discuss this. So I'm eager to learn from them as well. I'm honored to be joined by Neel Kashkari, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. We've also got Professor David Williams, chair of the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And we also have Ppp Hamburg, Foreign Secretary, National Academy of Medicine, and 21st Commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Hello, everyone. It's morning here on the West Coast. It may be afternoon for you, but I hope everyone is doing well. So we're going to get to, I see some waves. I don't know how much everyone is seeing, but I've done quite a few Zoom panels over the last 6 months. And I have to say, they just keep getting better and better. People are feeling more willing to engage. And I hope that can be the case with this as well, because we are welcoming viewers across a number of platforms, CNBC.com, of course, Harvard Chan, and anywhere else that you may be watching the live stream. So welcome to everyone as well. Please do engage with us. We have a group of really fascinating people who are well equipped to think about these issues. Can't promise answers, but we will certainly discuss some of the really hard issues. Submit your questions, comments as well, please, if you hear something that interests you in the Zoom chat and in the Facebook comments. I believe on Twitter as well, the handle at Harvard Public Health. And let's start. I want to start with this slide because it really does bring up some of these hard truths. I think many of us are aware of them, but it is certainly worth just flagging them here. Throughout this crisis, take a look at the disparities and impacts in the US. Nearly 80% of children who have died were children of color. Black and Latino people are nearly twice as likely to die as white people. Latinos and African Americans 3 times as likely to become infected as their white neighbors. More than 40% of Black and Latino workers cannot work remotely compared to 25% of white workers. There was also a statistic that came out just this morning. It really caught my attention and it speaks to who we have on this esteemed panel right now. It came from Citigroup, a bank that we talk about often on CNBC. But this morning, we brought them up in our editorial morning where we talk about the direction of the day's content. Citigroup estimates that the US lost about $16 trillion in GDP over the last 20 years because of race-based inequalities. If the US could instantly end the most severe forms of economic discrimination against African Americans, that could give a 5 trillion, that's trillion with a T, boost to GDP over the next 5 years. Neel, let me come to you first on this. When we have spent trillions this year trying to shore up the economy, how does the statistic make you feel? If we could just solve these problems of racial disparity, GDP would enjoy an incredible boost.
Yeah, if anything, I think those numbers are probably on the low end. I mean, just think about the education disparities in our country. How many young people, low-income kids, children of color, are not getting a good education? That is human potential, human capital that is being squandered. And it's a huge cost, obviously, to them individually and their families, but it's a huge cost to society. And so I think I applaud Citigroup for doing that analysis. I bet if we dug in deeper, we could find the numbers are even bigger than that. Obviously, solving these challenges is of paramount importance, but they're also hard challenges to solve.
Right, that's the next hard part. How do you solve them? But Peggy, I want to ask you, does this number surprise you? Is it expected? Do you think it's on the low end as well, like Neel does?
Well, I'm not a financial expert, but I do think that it's important that we look at it in economic terms and that we look at it in human terms, and they have to go together. It's an extraordinary number, and it certainly can and should be a wake-up call that there are lots of different reasons why we need to address this problem. I'm, a health person, so I look at it from health, and there's just no doubt that we have long-standing disparities in health that are impacting opportunities in many ways, opportunities for quality of life and length of life, but also, of course, opportunities to be active in the world of work and commerce and as full participants in driving our economy.
Okay, and David, a quick comment from you as well. Is this a wake-up call from the academic side? This likely doesn't come as a surprise to you, but how do you view it?
It certainly is a wake-up call, and it's a powerful reminder that COVID-19 and the disparities we see in COVID-19 are not new. COVID-19 has shown a magnifying glass on disparities that have existed for more than 100 years. So it's an urgent call for us to make new steps, make changes that we can avoid this in the future.
There's a lot of calls to action over the last year. And Neel, coming back to you, I want to point out that New York Times op-ed piece that you wrote last month, you said that the only way to get the virus under control is a full lockdown. But even that extreme a measure wouldn't do enough to protect many essential workers, many of them Black or brown. If a full lockdown, though, this call to action that you had early on in the crisis, it didn't happen then, how likely is it to happen a second time if the numbers get bad again or even worse? What can we do to bring the virus under control for every American?
Well, I need to, I wrote that op-ed with Mike Osterholm, a noted epidemiologist, looking at the experiences around the country. We know New York got off to a very rocky start in controlling it, but they've done a really good job in getting the case count down and then keeping it under control with a measured opening and testing and tracing. I think as a country, we have a fundamental question. Are we okay with 1,000 Americans a day dying? And that's the course that we're on. And so right now, if we stay the course that we're on, it is already disproportionately affecting low-income Americans and communities of color, just the data you started out with in introducing this panel. And you're right, if we did a full lockdown, there would still be essential workers who would need to staff the grocery stores or the hospitals, et cetera. And they, again, are disproportionately communities of color. And I don't know how to solve this so it's a perfect solution for everyone. But if we stay on the path that we're on with 1,000 Americans dying a day, that is devastating for the country, for those families, and disproportionately affects low-income people. I believe we can do better than that.
Peggy, did you think that a full lockdown is necessary? Do you think that this is still something we need, even if we may never get there?
I don't think realistically that is going to happen, but I think what we need to do is really follow science and good public health practice. We can have an approach that is modulated in different ways depending on the circumstances in different parts of the country, but we have to know. We need a strategy. We still don't have a national testing strategy. We still don't have availability of all the testing that we need. Without that, we don't know where the virus is and where it's moving. And we're still not seeing, it's extraordinary at this point, people following the guidance that is so important in terms of social distancing, wearing masks, hand and respiratory hygiene. And if we could do those things, we'd make a difference. Moreover, we need to have policies so that we're not bringing people in communities with lots of spread into indoor crowded settings like bars, in restaurants too, I regret to say. And we certainly shouldn't be doing big, large mass gatherings right now. So we can and must do better. And, you know, the public has responded in amazing ways to this unexpected and unprecedented health threat, with all of its implications for social dislocation and economic pain. But we have to have it be sustained till we can actually control this virus, get this disease under control, and hopefully move forward together.
Yeah, I think what everyone I'm hearing agrees with is there needs to be more done. This is far from over, and there needs to be some coordination. Of course, I also want to talk about the wealth gap, and the wealth actually is crucial to closing any health gap that we've been talking about. There's the have and have nots in public health as well as in the markets when it comes to wealth. Black Americans have less at nearly every juncture of life. In the New York Times, Ron Lieber and Tara Siegel, they broke out all the ways that Black Americans have less than whites. And if you haven't taken a look at it, those in our audience, I recommend. It's a really good visual that really hammers home what that disparity is. According to the Urban Institute, the gap in the home ownership rate between Black and white families in the US is bigger today than it was legal to refuse to sell someone a home because of the color of their skin, which is quite jaw-dropping. And I also just wanted to drop in an anecdote. This is something that we've been looking at CNBC as well. My colleague, Diana Olick, she did this great piece about Achille Ackridge. She's a Black homeowner in Maryland who had all the right statistics. He had a steady 6-figure salary, 800 FICO score, 20% equity in a home. When he started to look to refinance, he was asked by multiple agents to disclose his race, and he experienced discrimination time and time again. This was just a capsule, a microcosm that really is behind the facts that we just showed you on screen. David, what goes through your head? How do we fix this problem in particular?
There's a lot that we need to do, and we need to keep in mind that the fact that a problem exists is not by chance. It's not an act of God. It's not an accident. It really reflects the successful implementation of social policies in the past. So, for example, the fact that African Americans own homes at a markedly lower rate reflects the exclusion of African Americans in the post-World War II era, when homes and mortgages were made readily available to Americans, and populations of color really were by policy prevented from fully capitalizing on those opportunities. I like to think that we need to build communities of opportunity. Communities of opportunity where individuals have access to high quality education, have access to good paying jobs. And we need to think strategically of the policies we can implement to create opportunity so that everyone can benefit. And as the data shows, we all benefit when we take care of those who are left behind.
Right, trillions of dollars in benefit for the economy, particularly, which helps so many. And Neel, coming to you, it's not just home ownership, but it's really from birth to death. When you look at college degrees, retirement, inheritance, the median household income, there's been a debate this year on what the Fed can or should do. What are your thoughts? Can the Fed do more? And is it in a position that it should be?
Well, The accumulated wealth gap, this is the accumulation of disparities over many generations, and they add up and they get passed down from one generation to another. The key question right now is, can we stop it even from getting worse? Because on the course that we're on, with the education disparities that you talked about, with the economic disparities, the opportunity disparities, these gaps are just going to continue to grow as they get passed on from generation to generation. In terms of the Fed, we have lending powers. We have the ability to lend into the economy. We don't have the ability to make grants, as an example. So one thing that we're doing at the Minneapolis Fed is we've launched a research center called the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute to focus the research of our brilliant PhD economists to try to understand these gaps, the root cause, and what potential solutions are. Even if they're not solutions the Fed directly can control, if we can arm Congress and other policymakers with the best data and analysis so they can craft fiscal policy tools, then we want to do that. That's a role we can play. One direct role we do have is in overseeing banks through the Community Reinvestment Act to encourage banks to make credit widely available. We are doing that. We need to continue to do that. And I think we're just updating how we do that. That's a small piece of a much bigger story, but we're going to do whatever we can, recognizing that our tools are limited.
And Peggy, for you in the public health space, how important is it that institutions that perhaps they don't have a mandate to address these issues, but perhaps that's changing? How important is it that they bring that into the fold, that they have a focus on this and create policies that do address racial inequalities, wealth inequalities, and how does that trickle down into public health?
Well, one of the great lessons that I learned early on in public health, I certainly wasn't taught this in medical school, is that a lot of what's really important for health happens outside of a clinical care setting or a hospital, and that health isn't just the absence of disease, but it's the conditions that can support health and can support wellness and quality of life. And I think, when you look at all of the health challenges before us, it's not just your genetic makeup or your exposure to a specific disease, but it's also your income and your SES, your occupation, your educational status, your housing situation, and of course, issues like nutrition and ability to exercise and other things. The so-called social determinants of health are at least as important as other factors. And so we really have to rethink how we address health, how we care for health, how we support it. And that requires, a very multifactorial, multidimensional approach, and not just thinking about what happens to you when you get through the clinic door. It's a whole other discussion, which is an important one in terms of disparities in quality of care, access to care, and access to health insurance. But I think, we really need to reframe how we think about health.
Right. And a lot of these are, existential questions that will be determined and debated for many years to come. So I like this question from Megan in the audience. She says that the pandemic is devastating communities of color right now. What can we do in the next few months to actually help them? And David, I'll direct this one to you at first.
Yeah, I want to talk about the depth of the impact of the pandemic first. Before the pandemic came, Black children are 3 times as likely as white children to lose a mother by age 10. And Black adults are twice as likely to lose a child by age 30 and a spouse by age 60. So I'm saying because of the pre-existing disparities in health, we already have massive loss of life. And when we see these losses, you're also losing economic supports within the community, in addition to important social ties. So the pandemic is just making things a lot worse. And we talked about the racial gap in wealth. A report from the Federal Reserve Board shows for every dollar of wealth white households have, African-American households have 10 pennies and Latino households have 12 pennies. And when you have little wealth or no wealth, you're one paycheck away from being homeless. You're one paycheck away from being able to take care of your family, feed your family. And so that we have done some things along the lines of relief, but we've not done enough. And a lot of times when we provide assistance, we look at income. I have argued we need to look at wealth, because if we look at income, we understate the depth of economic deprivation that some households have, and we can make a difference. We are the richest country in the world. It's about what are our policy preferences. What do we want to do? We can do better than we're doing right now.
David, what can we do in terms of immediate action? Any ideas?
We have, there was some limits on mortgage, on protecting individuals who couldn't pay their mortgage. Many of these things are expiring. Similarly, for utilities, many families, unless we act, will lose their utilities in the next few months, will be put out of their homes, whether they're renting or purchasing in the next few months. So there is economic benefits that could be targeted to disadvantaged Americans that would make a difference for them providing for their families.
Neel, has the administration, Congress, but also the Fed, there's been a lot of very big actions that have been taking a lot of money put into the system, but does it address the people that need it most, whether that's lending facilities or the PPP or the potential of more stimulus?
Well, I think Congress acted very boldly early on in this crisis. I mean, much to, I think, at least to my surprise, I was surprised how quickly they acted and how they came together and were very generous. And one of the things we learned in the 2008 crisis is we were too targeted in our responses. And so one of my recommendations was err on the side of being generous. So, for example, extending the additional $600 a week in unemployment assistance, that was very powerful in helping families pay their credit card bills, put food on the table, pay their rent, pay their mortgage. And we know as the economy has somewhat come back, some people have been able to go back to work, but many people who thought they were on temporary furlough are now realizing they're on permanent layoff status, and they're going to need continued assistance. So the best thing, the most powerful thing anybody could do in the next couple months is to get more assistance in the hands of families who have been disproportionately affected by this, people who've lost their jobs and the frontline workers that we talked about earlier. I think that could be very powerful until we can get this virus under control and try to get the economy back to a strong place where people can be gainfully employed again. That's something that could happen quickly if Congress comes back together to take the action.
Are you optimistic that will happen quickly? I think you said but I think also many others were surprised that Congress was able to get that fiscal stimulus, that first round together so quickly. Is that going to happen? What are the stakes?
I mean, the stakes are huge for the economy as a whole, for all of us, but especially for those families who are directly affected. Election politics, we're so close to the election, and now with the Supreme Court confirmation battle that's going to be kicking off here, I don't know. I mean, I hope Congress can come together and say, this is important not just for those families who are directly affected. This is important for the American economy as a whole. And if we want to have a strong recovery, keeping families whole so that they can put food on the table and can pay their bills. If they can't pay their bills, this is going to ripple through the economy. Because if somebody can't pay their rent, then their landlord can't pay his or her mortgage, and then the losses roll up into the banking sector. So it's actually in all of our interests to make sure that families can continue to put food on the table and pay their bills until we can get this virus under control.
Right. I'm sure we all agree how high the stakes are, but a quick show of hands, because I'd love to just get all three of your answers to this. Are you optimistic that we get more much needed fiscal stimulus before the end of the year? Yes or no? Yes is a hand up. No is a hand down. Okay. So, clearly there's a lot of work to be done. And Peggy, you ran the FDA. We've been talking about how a lot of these issues certainly precede the pandemic. Do you think that there has been enough decent investment in public health? Do you think that will change?
Well, let me take you back a few decades in my career. I was also the health commissioner for New York City in the 1990s. And it was really stunning to me when I arrived in that job to see how you took the poorest communities in New York City and then you looked at health status indicators, and every single one, it just stacked up: infant mortality, maternal mortality, early childhood illness, under immunization, infectious diseases like sexually transmitted diseases, HIV, tuberculosis, chronic diseases, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, stroke. And that has been persisting for a very, very long time. Then you look at, how are we doing addressing those problems in terms of our healthcare system? And we know that many of those people with problems aren't getting access to preventive care and services. They're not getting access to appropriate ongoing medical care. They're not getting appropriate follow-up. So there is an accumulation of challenges here that have been persistent. Then you go to a place like the FDA, which is a public health agency. It's a science-based regulatory agency with a mission to promote and protect the American people. And a lot of what it does is trying to help make sure that the medical products needed are available to people. And part of that is that the studies have to be done to find out what products work, are they safe, how should they be used, and on whom should they be used. And again, we have seen persistent disparities now over quite a long period of time, where even for diseases where the burden of disease is most pronounced in communities of color, the products are not actually being studied in those populations. So we don't know necessarily how best to use them. And then we, going beyond just FDA to our broader healthcare system, we don't necessarily have the systems to ensure that those products get to the people who need them. So it is a systemic problem, a persistent problem. I hope, as we've been talking about, that maybe because of the sharp and glaring spotlight on COVID on these problems and the importance of addressing them for all of us, hopefully we can make changes that won't just be limited to how do we get the right care to the right people for COVID, but address some of the fundamental problems and concerns.
Peggy, I think that fits into what David was talking about earlier, is that the pandemic has laid bare a lot of these inequalities and lack of resources that existed well before the pandemic. And David, it's interesting, especially when we talk about the FDA and the government's response to the pandemic. And in many cases, at least on CNBC, we're seeing businesses sort of come forward and perhaps what's the right way of saying it, pick up the slack. You have drug makers saying that they will not release a vaccine unless it is properly tested, unless it is safe. Should we be relying on businesses to do that? How do you judge also the role of public health authorities throughout the pandemic?
I mean, we have, I go back to the importance of the point Peggy made about the importance of the science. We need to follow the science. And I think good scientists have protocols that they follow in terms of the development of the vaccine. One of the challenges we face in our society that there are so many voices and we don't have the leadership and the coordination and speaking with one voice. And we live in an era when persons decide on what facts they would like to accept and what facts are alternative facts. And that is not helpful for providing the American public with a consistent message. I think the bottom line is we need to do due diligence and develop the vaccines and build the trust that we need with communities, that they can trust the science that has taken place, and to know that the vaccines would be safe and you wouldn't have to worry about using them. But there's work we need to do in that space because of the mixed messages that people have received so far.
And I think with this topic, we've sort of hit a nerve from our audience, which is great. I love seeing this participation. Neel, let me pose this one to you. This is from Valeria on Zoom. She asks, how can we gain confidence back in the institutions that are supposed to protect us after the CDC first stated that masks don't work when we knew all along that they do? How much, especially given how much they're being politicized? David just gave a good response on this, but she says it's discouraging what we're seeing. Neel, do you agree? How do you judge the response and the politicization of essentially science?
Well, people need to have confidence, just as David said. We were all hoping for, fingers crossed, for a vaccine that could come and finally get this virus under control and let us return to normal, the way life was in January or earlier. But unless people have confidence that the vaccine has gone through all of the appropriate testing, we're already seeing it in surveys. How likely are you to take a vaccine? The trends seem to be down because people are losing confidence. So it's essential that the scientists speak up. And I think, I talk to a lot of health experts like Peggy, like David, their peers. There's a lot we don't know about coronavirus. So I'm not going to criticize that, hey, we thought something 6 months ago and now we've learned and now we've changed our views. That's the nature of discovery. That's the nature of something new, a new disease. But I think it behooves all of us to be honest about what we know, to be honest about what we don't know, what we think we know. I think the American people respond very well if they are told the unvarnished truth about what we know, what we don't know, and what we are still trying to find out. And then they will respond. They'll take that on board and they will respond. So I was pleased personally when I saw the CEOs come out and say, we're not going to move forward with the vaccine until it's gone through all the protocols. That gave me more confidence as an individual who does someday want to get a coronavirus vaccine. I think the more people can speak out about that and say, we're only going to do the right thing based on the science for the American people, I think then that can help restore confidence.
I have to say,
we got to go to Peggy on this. I was going to say, go ahead.
As a former FDA commissioner and also someone that has done clinical research in the past in the drug development area for HIV/AIDS, it actually made me deeply sad to see that statement. On the one hand, I was glad because I think many different voices need to be brought to the table to say this is too important. We cannot let politics interfere with the science. But it almost is like a given. I mean, what company would want to move a vaccine into the marketplace if the studies hadn't been done and we didn't know about its safety and its effectiveness? And that we've come to a place in the midst of a global pandemic in particular, where there's such distrust of the critical federal science agencies and such distrust of our political leadership as well to do the right thing, that we're scrambling to build the trust and confidence that should be built into the system. And that certainly when I was at the FDA, I spent a lot of time and put a lot of effort in to trying to help people understand what we did at the FDA and why, to try to increase the transparency around what we did and to make sure that we had trust and confidence, recognizing that we had to earn it every day by the actions that we took.
So Peggy, has the FDA changed since you were there, or is it our perception of the FDA that has changed because we're in such a politicized environment? Is there the ability for them to feel pressure in this different climate we're in?
Well, we are at a very unusual, dare I say, unprecedented time, and it's enormously worrisome. All of the federal science agencies have been under attack. I think I just have to say it bluntly. It's certainly the FDA, the CDC, the EPA, and others questioning the science, questioning the integrity of the career scientists and other employees that work so hard in all of these agencies. And, sadly, the failure to make the critical connection on the part of some of our political leaders that, in fact, you can't spin these problems. A virus could care less what a poll is saying or what a politician pronounces. It's going to keep doing what it is, genetically made to do, which is to reproduce and spread, unless we put in place the programs and policies to stop that. And that requires, building on good science, doing the studies that are needed, following that science, and implementing.
Those are great points. Another question from the audience from Eric, this one for David. He says that you have said that the United States needs a new kind of herd immunity. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. I think there's a JAMA editorial in which we talked about the need, myself and Lisa Cooper, for herd immunity. And what we meant by that, we are in the midst of a pandemic right now. There will be other pandemics in our future. How do we take actions now that will protect the vulnerable for the future pandemics? So it goes back to what we can do, the investments we can make to create communities of opportunity, to reduce some of the exposures, to ensure that everyone has access to good preventive care so that we can be in a better position when the next pandemic comes. So it's about making investments now to ensure better health in the future.
So you're not talking about letting people get the virus and building an immunity. You're talking about more of a structural change. Is that correct?
It's more about structural policy changes that put people in a stronger sense. And part of that goes back to a point I think that was made a while ago by Peggy. The CDC estimates that if the money we spend on medical care, and we spend more money on medical care absolutely and per person than any other country in the world, but only 3 cents of every dollar spent on medical care is spent on prevention. And so that we can have a greater emphasis on prevention and a greater emphasis on strengthening the social infrastructures to reduce the negative impacts of social determinants of health that will put people in a stronger position for the next pandemic.
Neel, a question for you, and you actually referenced this earlier. A Pew study reports that not only do Black Americans face higher COVID risks, but they're also more skeptical of vaccines. We had a CNBC survey of the battleground states that said something similar, and you mentioned that number, that skepticism or willingness to take a vaccine is decreasing. So what can be done? Is that a valid fear, especially when we've talked about the politicization of this process, but what can be done with regards to it? And especially for Black Americans, so that health disparities, they don't grow even larger when we do have a viable one.
Right. Well, I think it's the things that we were talking about, which is all of the health experts, whether it's the CEOs or people like Peggy and David, or the people running the various agencies today, come forward and say that they are all standing united to only bring forward a vaccine that has been vetted, that has gone through all the scientific protocols, and making sure. I mean, I've read that there are challenges that vaccine manufacturers have in attracting communities of color to participate in the trials themselves. And if they're not participating in the trials, then it's hard to have confidence that these vaccines are going to be safe. A public health expert early on said to me, if you're going to give something to hundreds of millions of people, the hundreds of millions of people includes a lot of heterogeneity within that. It may affect young people differently than older people. It could affect different races differently. And so I guess I would really defer to David and Peggy in what more the health experts can do. Because I'll look at it from this way. From the economy perspective, we are all hoping and waiting for a vaccine to get back to normal. If people do not have confidence to take the vaccine, it doesn't do us any good. And then we're going to be stuck in this very rocky, muted recovery of a partial economic recovery until we have that confidence that the vaccine is safe.
And I think it's important that we put this into perspective, into historical perspective. The African-American community and other communities of color have been lied to by federal researchers in the past. The Tuskegee syphilis study just stands out as one example of that. So I think we need to do special outreach to those communities with spokespersons that they can identify with, that they can relate to, and work with community leaders. There's more outreach needs to be done, because when the vaccine is available, we certainly need everyone to take it.
That is such a great point, David. Peggy, to speak about some of the history and how you have to overcome past mistakes, I guess.
Yeah, well, and so much of it comes down to communication and trust. And you can't just build that overnight, but it is really important, as David was just saying. We need to make sure that we are demonstrating our trustworthiness. And some of that is, the actions that leaders take and how they talk to the public, and being open and honest about, what the problems are, but also what we're going to do to address them. But it's also recognizing that we need to engage communities in different ways, and not just, sort of throw data at them and say, this is what you need to know, but get people that they respect and trust in their communities, talking to them and helping to bring them along and reassure. So, we really need to sort of weave a blanket of trust and trustworthiness, which right now is really frayed. And this political environment every time I think maybe we're making progress, it's like people start, pulling at it and cutting holes in it and undermining it. But if we can't get this right, none of the rest of it is going to come together. And that it was mentioned about the Tuskegee experiment, and that has had lasting effects in terms of willingness of communities of color, and particularly the African American community, to participate in clinical trials because they know that they weren't dealt with honestly. It was a study to look at the pathology and disease progression of syphilis, but individuals didn't understand that they weren't receiving a treatment that would work. It was unethical. And in retrospect, we were studying the pathology of racism, really, that these lives were expendable because there were some scientific questions that we wanted answered in, the research community, and people have recognized how wrong it was, apologized officially for it, and tried to overcome it. But we're still seeing that, going back to my tenure at FDA. I'm sorry for the long answer, but, we were working to try to bring more people of color into clinical trials, particularly on diseases that, disproportionately impacted those populations. And it's crucial for COVID that we understand the impacts of the vaccine and other potential therapeutic interventions. But it's very hard to engage certain populations in these trials for reasons of this distrust. And also, these trials often are done in elite research institutions that people don't, even know about the studies, and it's hard to get there, and it has all kinds of additional requirements that are hard to understand. So we need to think about even doing clinical research differently to sort of bring it to the people where they are and help them understand why it matters for them and for the people they care about and love.
Mm-hmm. So there's history here to overcome. Communication, I believe all three of you have said, is essential. But let's take this one step further. It's not just about vaccines, it's about vaccinations. And of course, we live in a capital market. On CNBC, we talk day in, day out about these trials that may or may not be promising, but inevitably there will be issues in terms of access to vaccines and therapies. And for people who have money to pay for access, Neel, what are your thoughts here? What does that next stage look like once we have one? Who's going to be able to have access? How important is that it goes to the right people? And how optimistic again are you?
Well, this pandemic is costing us trillions and trillions of dollars for the economy, lost economic output, and then the fiscal spending needed to try to bridge this terrible downturn that we have because of the virus. Any amount of money that the government needs to spend that can shorten the duration of this crisis from 18 months to 17 months, whatever, it will more than pay for itself by reducing the economic damage and the cost to support people who've lost their jobs. So my humble advice is, whatever the vaccine costs, the government should make it widely available for free to anybody who needs it, whether it's a vaccine or a therapy. This will pay for itself many, many times over just by getting this virus and getting the crisis under control. But then I have to defer to Peggy and David in terms of when the vaccine becomes available, who gets it first and how's it rolled out. I know that there are sophisticated deliberations that need to take place. I'll defer to them, but any amount of money that could be spent to shorten the duration of this crisis will more than pay for itself in terms of the economy.
I want to take another question from the audience, this time Alexis. Let's pose this one to David. He asks, would universal healthcare help address the health and financial disparities we're discussing, or are there downsides to universal healthcare that we should consider? And as I mentioned, I'm Canadian, so I love this question. David, what do you think?
Well, I think universal healthcare is a good thing, but universal healthcare does not address all of the social determinants of health. And I would give Exhibit A to the questioner. Let's look at the racial data from the United Kingdom. The racial gaps in England and Wales are larger than in the US. Blacks in England and Wales have an age-adjusted death rate from COVID-19 that is 4.1 times higher than that of whites, and Pakistani and Bangladeshi in England and Wales have a COVID death rate that's 3.5 times higher than that of whites. So, and they all have access to the National Health Service, which is universal health care. So universal health care is important, but in part because our healthcare system functions well as a repair shop that takes care of people once they get sick. It isn't a drive of whether people get sick or not in the first place. So we really have to invest in those factors outside of the healthcare system, the places where we spend most of our times, our homes, our neighborhoods, our schools, our workplaces, and make sure that they are healthy and that they are promoting health in all that is done, so that we can use universal healthcare, which we do need, and it's vital and it's important, and it's a shame that as a country we don't have it, but it's not a magic bullet to solve the disparities that we see.
Absolutely. Those are all really great points. And we are getting some really good questions from the audience too. So I'm jumping around a little bit here. But this one caught my eye, particularly from Christina, because I started this by saying, I feel uncomfortable watching the markets go up. I cover technology. So some of the biggest tech companies in the world have created so much wealth at this time, but then there's small businesses, and we've started to hear from a lot of them more than we ever have in the past, at least since I've been at CNBC. So Christina's question, I'll pose this to you, Neel, huge difference between big business and small business owners. What advice do you have for small business owners on how to survive the pandemic? And Neel, I was just watching Fed Chair Powell yesterday talk about the small business loan facility that has been so underutilized. Why is that? How can the Fed in particular better help small businesses?
Well, one of the things Congress did that was very powerful was the original PPP program, which, as you know, it's a loan, but it becomes a grant if you keep your employees. That was very powerful because a lot of small businesses and mid-sized businesses that I've spoken with say, hey, a loan doesn't do us any good. Our doors are shut. They've been shut for months. We don't know when we can reopen. We can't afford to take out a loan that we may not be able to pay back. They really need a grant. And that's why the PPP was so powerful. Now, the PPP was designed to be a couple-month bridge. Believe it or not, back in March, we were all hopeful, maybe this will just be a couple-month event. We shut down hard for a couple months. We get it under control. We go back to normal. And that's what the PPP was designed for. So the Main Street program, which is what you're referencing, has had very little take-up because it is a lending program. And many businesses are simply saying, we don't need a loan. We need more direct fiscal support, which is a grant. Unfortunately, the Fed does not have the ability to give grants. That can only be done by Congress. So this is, I hope, back to our earlier conversation, I hope both parties come together and say they're going to take more action to support people who've lost their jobs, but also to support the small businesses. We are seeing thousands and thousands of small businesses across the country shutter. And you think about that, the recovery is going to be much slower. That small business, that restaurant that goes out of business, there's going to be a vacant storefront for 6 months, for a year, till a new business can form, can take that space, can hire new staff. It's going to be a much slower recovery if we allow these thousands and thousands of small businesses to go out, to go under. And that really is where Congress is going to have to step up.
And yet all three of you are skeptical that we can get more fiscal stimulus this year, at least, because of the deadlock in Washington. Peggy, how do you view, I know that you're on the public health side, but how critical, if you could draw the line between public health and small businesses, particularly when it comes to insurance, what is the link that you see there? How important is it for us right now as a country, as an economy, to help small businesses?
Well, I think it's crucially important. The strategies to most effectively do it are definitely outside my domain of expertise. But I think, that is what keeps so many communities, chugging along. And so many families are depending on, small businesses, both for their employment and for other vital services in their community. And we have to think holistically. We can't just have a million siloed programs. We have to recognize that we have to come together to do the things necessary from a public health perspective to control this pandemic. We have to support people in their critical needs, and doing some of the public health measures have, unfortunately, caused huge dislocations in our economy, including small business. And so we have to do our best to help shore that up in the short term enable us to continue to do those public health measures that may not allow the full benefits of opening up to small businesses. So we have to sort of be working hand in glove as we move forward towards hopefully a better future.
Right, and behind small businesses and individuals as well, the banking system, right? And David, let's go to you on this one, but it's never been particularly fair or friendly to Black or brown people. This again precedes the crisis. You look at something like predatory lending or access, simple access, the underbanked. It's a shockingly still big population in the United States. Have you seen any changes there? Has that been magnified throughout the pandemic? How do we make sure that we don't let any progress over the last few years roll back?
Yeah, you're right that it's an area of enormous challenge. It's an area where high quality research studies have documented that Blacks and other populations of color experience discrimination in terms of access to credit and access to mortgages and access to loans. So it is an area where we need to think of what we can do to be more effective and to provide user-friendly services to populations of color and to poor communities. It's an area where that kind of investment is vital as we look to the future, and we want to engage everyone fully in the American economy.
Right, and Neel, come to you on this as well, because we have seen language from the Federal Reserve this year focusing on these underrepresented groups. What can the Fed do? In your view, how has the banking sector changed or not changed?
Well, it's a long, persistent problem. I mean, the Federal Reserve has very aggressive programs. We have bank examiners to go in and look at how banks are making lending decisions. And the data is mixed. On one hand, you do see studies where there are clear racial disparities, and then the banks will also say, well, there are also income disparities. And so, it's a complicated issue that goes back to the fundamental disparities in our society, from education to jobs to economic opportunity. I mean, the analogy that you gave at the start about, I think it was an African-American gentleman who had very high credit score, strong income, and he was asked his race on a bank application. I mean, that's just outrageous. I mean, that should be looked at by regulators and should be pursued, and the bank should be held accountable. I mean, that's just overt racism. That still happens in society today. We need to address that. It's the more subtle things that are even harder to address, and we need to go after those as well.
Yeah, I think all of us were blown away by that story, and it was so important to get on a CNBC. And it fits into this theme that there's perhaps a mythology that we have achieved great racial progress, yet we've talked a lot about the examples today where that's just simply not true, not the case at all. So let's end. We're short on time now, but I do want to get perhaps a bit of optimism from all of you. What are we doing right? Let's start with Peggy. How do we move forward to reconcile that myth, perhaps a hopeful one, and the reality that we're actually in and that perhaps is being exemplified in this crisis?
Well, I hope what we're going to get right, responding to COVID and responding to these deeper, broader issues of racial disparities in health and so many other domains, is that we can't afford to be complacent about problems that are real. And, we've done that in terms of pandemic preparedness, and we've certainly done that in terms of these disparities. We've sort of hoped that if we go along and just continue to try to either grow the economy, as people say, or try to address, isolated health problems as they come, that somehow we'll muddle through. But we really have to recognize that some of these problems are just going to deepen, they're going to keep cycling back, and they're going to feed on each other in devastating ways. So I hope that we will be able to build some strategies that reflect the complexity of the issues before us, but also recognize that there are many things that we can and should do, but we have to commit to do them, and we have to commit in a sustained way.
And David, let's go to you next. What's our obligation moving forward?
Well, I think I am inspired by my students. I'm inspired by the young people in America who, of all racial backgrounds, who are saying enough is enough and are marching, have gone to the streets to say they want a better future that is more fair and just for all Americans. So that movement is a source of inspiration to me.
And Neel, last word from you.
Well, I share David and Peggy's optimism, and I'm hopeful. We've had these disparities for a long time. We've had, in Minneapolis, where I live, we obviously had the tragedy of George Floyd's killing, and then the riots and the destruction that followed. I hope that this is really a turning point and that we're going to really come together and take bold action. But we all have to make that happen. I remind folks that Rodney King was beat 30 years ago and nothing changed after that, even though that got national attention. So we need to seize this moment, whether it's COVID or the racial awakening that we're having, and actually drive forward to really change things. It's going to be up to us.
Well, I think we've confronted a lot of the hard stats, hard questions here today. We certainly have more questions than answers, but I appreciate all three of you being so candid, breaking it down, not holding back, because I think if we've learned anything, we have to address this head on. And we're at a point now where this is more important than ever. We can't wait to the next crisis when we're sitting here again saying that this is systemic. We should have made changes the last time. So I want to thank you to Dean Williams, Neel Kashkari, David Williams, Peggy Hamburg. Thank you to our audience. Those were fantastic questions, better questions than I could come up with. And really got some great responses as well. You can, of course, watch this later on demand on Facebook at Harvard Public Health, the Harvard Chan YouTube channel, and on the forum at the Harvard Chan School website. And let me tell you, I've watched the previous 4 discussions. They were fantastic. So there are 2 more that you will get your chance to watch. Here they are. October 6th at 1 p.m. Eastern, Human Rights Equals Public Health, a conversation with Michelle Bachelet. And on October 21st at the same time, No One Should Be Shocked, a conversation with Ed Young. They are sure to be really engaging, really great. And as we say goodbye, I want to leave you with this thought from the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's on many of our minds right now, from a 2013 dissent on the Voting Rights Act decision. So if we can pull up that slide, this is what she said. She said, throwing out preclearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. And I certainly could not close it out better than that, the great RBG. So with that, I just want to thank everyone again, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to moderate such a fascinating conversation. I think I'll either hand it back perhaps to Dean Williams, or I'll just say goodbye here. So thanks again, everyone, and stay safe, stay healthy, and please attend the next sessions. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.